American Institutions, which is one of our co-sponsors. And we've been running a series over this last year on the essence of a liberal education, defining the core, if there is one. And I wanted to accomplish a couple things in this little introduction, if that's all right, before I get to introducing Professor Berube. Because one of our purposes in this series is to highlight Phi Beta Kappa on campus and communicate to students that this is an important prestigious organization. They get a lot of honors society invitations in the mail, some from fly-by-night operations, and unfortunately more than half of our students who are invited don't elect to join Phi Beta Kappa at University of Texas. So we're activating a student chapter. We're trying to get some more publicity, more presence on campus as a serious intellectual organization, so students, when they get that letter in their junior or senior year inviting them, they'll realize that this is something they don't want to pass up on, that it's certainly important. We have, I think, 60 faculty and staff at UT who are members, and when you look at those 60, it's really the leaders on campus in most cases. And we've got over 50 UT students now who are active in our student chapter. So those of you who are students who've been elected as juniors or hope to get elected as juniors, we'll get some more information to you as time proceeds. For some book and discussion groups, special seminars with visiting lecturers, such as tomorrow, we're going to have an honor student get together with Professor Berube to talk about his recent book. The philosophy is the guide of life, is the motto of Phi Beta Kappa. And as I say, the Alpha of Texas chapter means we're the first chapter in Texas, of course. We've been in existence for over 100 years, is sponsoring this series in conjunction really with the rethinking of the core curriculum here at the University of Texas in order to stimulate some reflection on these first questions about what it's really important for students to know as a liberally educated person. So here are some of the co-sponsors, our program, Humanities Texas, UT Humanities Institute, Evan Carton, the National Phi Beta Kappa Society, Jack Miller Center, and the Phi Beta Kappa Alumni Association. So I think that's everybody. I hope I didn't miss anybody that contributed majorly to this. The program in Western Civilization is a concentration that was approved last year, and we've got 40 faculty from 13 or 14 now departments and schools across the campus, and are regularly offering courses in all these different departments that focus on some of the great texts of the Western tradition, basically. And we've got a Junior Fellows program, which is getting active. We've only been in existence for about 2 months. We've already got about 20 active students, and we're hoping to build on that. Website, of course, which you have to have, and myself and my Western Civ email address. So I thought I'd just run through real briefly some of the highlights of the series so far. And part of the reason for doing that is that in every case, except this first one, we have video recordings of the lectures on our website. So you can go back and really revisit the whole series if you'd like, or at least highlights of it. Unfortunately, we weren't technically adept enough for our very first lecture, so Professor Lewis from Harvard we didn't get. But we do have Robbie George from Princeton, who talked about civic literacy, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson from the Hoover Institution, the Ancient Greeks and Western Civilization, then and now, very interesting discussion about what we owe exactly to the ancient Greeks. Professor Waichi Dimmock from Yale, also talking about the ancient Greeks, about what we can learn from the Iliad about warfare and peace in the modern times. Just last month, Professor Martha Nussbaum, distinguished professor from the University of Chicago, who talked about freedom of conscience and religious equality in our Constitution. So touched on some of those basic questions of American civic life. And then tonight, we're really privileged to have Professor Michael Berube, the Paterno family professor of English at Penn State, and the author of a number of very important books, including What's Liberal About the Liberal Arts, which we'll talk about here in a bit. And then again, highlights for the future. I'm very excited about what we've got coming up next month. Professor Danielle Allen, recently appointed to the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. Don't get much more prestigious than that. And author of a very interesting book called Talking to Strangers, The Anxieties of Citizenship Since Brown versus Ford versus Education, which, at least looking at it, reading it as a philosopher, I see as a Aristotelian reflection on the evolving democracy in America. And she's going to be talking about On Becoming One's Idea of a Free Person, which I think is an intriguing title. And then Professor Herbert I. London, who was the founding dean, actually, of the Gallatin School at NYU, and the head of a think tank now in New York City, and he'll be talking about the battle for the curriculum. So we get a wide variety of perspectives, as you might surmise from the lectures. I've got some yellow cards in the back if you'd like to be updated about the lecture series, the 2 remaining lectures, just to be reminded that they're coming, or more about our Western Civ program, fill one of those out. So again tonight, Michael Berube. Here again are just a few of his notable works. He was very well known as a blogger. I guess he's a retired blogger now, but all of the blogs are archived, and he's actually contributing blogger to other blogs today. And the title is Somebody Killed Something That's Clear at Any Rate, Jabberwocky in the Western Canon. I assume that it has something to do with Jabberwocky, so I put that up there so Professor Berube would have something to work on for a second anyway. So let's welcome Professor Berube to speak to us. Michael.
Thanks, everyone. First thing to do is to tell, is that all right? Now I can say, with amplification, thanks for coming out this evening. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here. I did learn from the website on my last couple of weeks that UT was going through the process of rethinking its curricular offerings. My best wishes to you all for reasons that I think will become clear over the course of the next hour or so. And if I had PowerPoint things with me, I could put up actually the picture of the Jabberwock. But if anyone wants to see one, there is one on a website called Pandagon. There's a little announcement of this talk. But it's actually, the talk's not about the poem itself. The talk is about, it starts from Alice's response to it. If you're familiar with the canon of great children's literature, you remember Alice as reading Jabberwocky and then in the looking glass world and saying, somehow it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't know exactly what they are. However, somebody killed something, that's clear at any rate. This, I fear, and with good reason, is how most of my fellow citizens have responded to the great Western Canon wars of the late 1980s to the present. I opened with Jabberwocky instead of, say, some of the other usual canonical suspects for this kind of thing. Oh, Arnold's darkling plain swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where Indian armies clash by night. That usually gets hauled out. Or that bit about a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing from a writer whose name escapes me at the moment. But I want to suggest that there was something mildly surreal about the canon debates back then, just as there was a kind of opera bouffe quality to the political correctness brouhaha that immediately followed them in the early 90s. And I will insist that I have believed this actually for many years now, even before last month, when the New York Times Book Review published an essay by Rachel Donadio marking the 20th anniversary of the publication of Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, an essay, Donadio's that is, that wonderfully confirmed my sense of the essential rightness of my beliefs. I will discuss briefly that essay in the course of my talk this evening, and while I'm doing so, I'll even try to address myself to the topic of this lecture series, namely the essence of a liberal education and the problem of defining a core. But first, begging your indulgence, I will try to recap the last 20 years of debate over the core curriculum. With few exceptions, the cultural rights attacks on curricular revision have been ridiculous. These attacks have depended overwhelmingly on a campaign of distortions, most of which have not merely relied on, but exploited the fact that very few Americans have any idea what a core curriculum should contain. From 1988, the year William Bennett and the Wall Street Journal took up arms against Stanford University's Cultures, Ideas, and Values program, to 2007, with the publication of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni pamphlet, Vanishing Shakespeare, America's cultural right has waged this campaign against the humanities whose goal it is to conduct intellectual debate the way the swift-boat vets conduct political debate. And just as there are people today who believe that John Kerry lied about his service in Vietnam, so there are people who believe that Stanford caved in to Jesse Jackson and the chant of hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's got to go. A chant in which Jackson himself, for all his many faults, did not participate, and for which he in fact chastised Stanford students, reminding them that they and we are very much of the West. ACTA, that's the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, their pamphlet, Vanishing Shakespeare, and the website for it, greets readers by telling them, you love Shakespeare, American universities don't. I just had to bring that to Texas, because I know how much you hate Shakespeare here. From what I've gathered, actually, you've banished him to this, Winedale place, which is not even on campus. And just fortuitously, I happened to be preparing for this talk by watching ESPN, and it turns out there is a university out there that does hate Shakespeare. If you've seen ads for Kaplan University online, this is an online university that has a school of the liberal arts that has no humanities in it whatsoever. And the ad, for people watching ESPN and all, is, thank God, no more Shakespeare. There's a little, line barrier through it. So the day that ACTA picks up on Kaplan University's PR campaign, that'll be a funny day. That'll be a day when we can all read Jabberwocky clearly. But ACTA, I think, is just carrying on a noble tradition in the culture wars, a tradition that began with the attacks on Stanford. Because ACTA appeals to an audience that thinks of Shakespeare as America's greatest writer. And I'm not making that up. If you read the pamphlet as I have, you'll find that, now Shakespeare has suffered the unkindest cut of all. Unkindest cut of all, get it? It's Shakespearean. There he is saying out, out, but he's not saying that. But you get the idea. So too did the critics of Stanford's revised core curriculum try to get people to believe that Stanford had turned its back on centuries of teaching the best that is known and thought in the world. Even though, as it happened, the Cultures, Ideas, and Values program replaced a Western culture requirement that had been in place since 1980. That is, for all of 8 years. Before 1980, why? From 1970 to 1980, Stanford had no core curriculum in the humanities whatsoever. Like a lot of places, they scrapped it right around the 60s. And all during that low, dishonest decade of the 70s, Stanford students could meet the humanities requirement by taking any three-quarter combination of humanities courses. You see what I'm saying? Actually, what was going on was Western culture and the CIV program were something of a restoration of a core curriculum. And that's why I say core curriculum debate as conducted by people like Bennett has been a sham. It has made less sense than Jabberwocky. In going after Stanford, apparatchiks like Bennett were actually attacking one of the few American universities that take the humanities seriously and were willing to require every single undergraduate to meet a substantial humanities requirement. 15 years later, in 2002, they tried the same gambit with the University of Chicago, of all places. And Stanley Kurtz of the National Review floated the history on a claim that Chicago's curriculum revision amounted to, quote, one of the most important higher education stories of the year, close quote. What actually happened in the late spring of 2002 was that the University of Chicago's history department replaced most sections of its Western civilization course with two courses, Ancient Mediterranean World and European Civilization, thereby allowing faculty to go into more detail about the world before 1500 and the world after 1500. That was pretty much the breaking point for obvious reasons. The move was just the most recent of many tinkerings with the school's general education curriculum going back to 1949. One of the paradoxes, by the way, of the fact that the Great Books is itself a sort of registered trademark, and there are great books, and the Great Books Foundation. They have a journal, the Common Review, actually a wonderful journal, I think. I've written for it 4 or 5 times. But there never was a Great Books curriculum at Chicago. There was in 1940, there was Great Books, but it was never a required core. Western Civilization was created in 49. It existed through 1959. The course was then reduced from 3 academic quarters to 2. Then in 1966, the course was no longer required of all Chicago undergraduates. Then in the 1980s, all 4 undergraduate divisions offered a 3-quarter civilization course, including South Asian civilization, Islamic civilization, and Latin American civilization. You get my point. In a sane world, this is not the kind of thing about which advocacy groups would issue overheated press releases and organize protest campaigns. Their complaint about the revision in 2002 was that a single course had been made into 2. Oh my God, the continuity is broken. That really was the complaint. And what if students take them out of sequence? Yeah, there's a gasp. Okay, good. The controversy at Chicago, which consumed many Chicago alumni, really, they were consumed by flames. It seemed to me to be the work of sort of a small group of culture warriors who had stranded on that remote Pacific island since 1987, and who always still thought that Stanford students are still chanting, hey, hey, ho, ho, etc. Truly, I thought it is hard to fathom the motivations of people who hear that college professors at Chicago will be assigning more Cicero and spending more time on the principles behind the founding of the United States, and who respond by screaming bloody murder about the dumbing down of undergraduate education. So over the last 20 years, I've begun to suspect there's a kind of all-purpose national outrage network that is activated whenever any Western civilization program is revised, even for the better. A network run by people who have much too much time on their hands and far too much susceptibility to people like Bill Bennett, and way too little understanding of the history of college courses in Western civilization. one small point on that. It is sometimes made, the point is sometimes made by the cultural left that about the history of those college courses, that the first one, the Contemporary Civilization course at Columbia, was created as originally called War Issues, and was designed to persuade undergraduates that we had enough of a stake in what happened to Europe to go get involved in World War I, as if that point taints the courses ever after. I just think that's a substanceless kind of point to make. But the serious point to be drawn from it is that these courses are themselves of fairly recent date. Just in case I haven't made myself clear on this point, I think curricular revisions like those undertaken by Stanford and Chicago are praiseworthy things. And I would say the same of the revisions made to my own Columbia core curriculum. The revisions were made during the 1980s, too late to benefit me. The core that I knew from my undergraduate days when I took the Plato to Nietzsche and Homer to Dostoevsky courses included not a single woman on either syllabus. In my review of great books, this is David Denby's account of going back to Columbia in 1991, 1992 to retake the course. A very interesting book. It's been panned by some academics, I think, rather haughtily. I mostly liked it, although I noted that Denby, who's a reasonably intelligent guy, I mean, started off by noting he didn't really remember anything from reading these books at 19, which raises the question of whether 19 is the best age to read them. But I noted that in his reading lists for 91, 92, there were figures like Sappho, Christine de Pizan, Mary Wollstonecraft, Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, Simone de Beauvoir, and even Catherine MacKinnon. And I asked in my review, plaintively, would it be insufferably PC of me to point out that not a single one of those figures, not even Austen, was on the CC or Lit Hum syllabus when I was an undergraduate way back in the dark and final days of the Carter administration. The process by which major American universities finally came around to acknowledging that Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, W.B. Du Bois, and their ilk are writers of the first rank seems to me a triumph of democracy and a triumph of intellectual expertise. And you don't find that kind of harmonic convergence every day. That these curricular revisions were publicized as lowerings of intellectual standards was a travesty. And let's not pretend at this late date that all the rights attacks on curricular revision stemmed from a commitment to intellectual excellence. I think here of the late Peter Shaw, one of the founders of the National Association of Scholars, who told the Chronicle of Higher Education, quote, "What I truly believe is that second-rate traditionalist scholarship is ultimately more valuable to the country than first-rate feminist works." Close quote. Shaw uttered that stirring defense of second-raters in 1994. When he was a member of the National Council on Humanities, the advisory board to the National Endowment for the Humanities. Deep breath. But the academic left deserves its share of the blame for its part in Jabberwocky. First and most obviously, most of us had no idea what we were dealing with. No compelling public narrative explaining and justifying what we had done, and of course, almost no access to mass media. Our first representatives in national media back in the late 80s and early 90s were people like Stanley Fish and Catherine Stimson, who A, are moderate centrist folk to begin with, and B, did not understand that the attacks from the right were not an invitation to join a seminar discussion. On a personal note, that is why I entered the fray in the first place in 1991. I waited for anyone among my senior colleagues to step up and say, no, actually curricular revision isn't the same thing as deconstruction, and neither of them have anything to do with affirmative action and speech codes. And when after a year nobody did this, I wrote my own reply. I wanted to publish in the Village Voice. I was only in my second year as an assistant professor and really didn't know what I was doing either. But since then, however, I've learned to my dismay that the academic left's troubles are not just a matter of not having access to mass media. In some ways, our troubles would be worse if we had more regular access to mass media. I'm not going to complain about the academic left en masse. It's too large and various for that, and far too fractious and disorganized to be treated as a single corporate body. That said, however, I've learned to my dismay over the past decade and a half that there is indeed a wing of the academic left so insular and so devoted to the circular firing squad that its official motto should be, "We make Democrats look effective." This is the wing that has repeatedly responded to the right's baiting question, "Why do you hate America?" by replying, "Well, Mr. O'Reilly, the reasons we hate America are..." or, or actually, Mr. Hannity, I stopped beating my wife. No, I actually never stopped beating my wife. Every time there's some kind of flap about courses in Western culture, the academic left should be out front and center saying, hell yeah, we need more courses in Western culture and more courses in every aspect of the humanities. We don't think American undergraduates know enough about the classical world or the history of Christianity. We also don't think American undergraduates know enough about the history of the slavery debate in the Americas or the history of how Western societies have thought about disability, which, by the way, is a fascinating subject, right from the Greeks forward. Because the real travesty here has to do with the fact that almost every participant in these debates has managed to conduct him or herself as if the question of the Western canon is a matter of one college course. The right does it for obvious reasons, to pretend that any attention paid to writers like Mary Wollstonecraft or Simone de Beauvoir is attention not paid to Shakespeare or Homer. But the left does it without any good reason at all. And we've been doing it for more than 20 years now. Here, for example, is the late Lillian Robinson, whose influential essay, Treason Our Text, Feminist Challenges to the Literary Canon, was first published in 1983. It has been anthologized many times since and is now part of the canon of essays about the canon. Quote, when we turn from the construction of pantheons, which have no prescribed number of places, to the construction of course syllabi, then something does have to be eliminated each time something else is added. And here, ideologies, aesthetic and extra-aesthetic, do necessarily come into play. Is the canon, and hence the syllabus based on it, to be regarded as the compendium of excellence or as the record of cultural history? For there comes a point when the proponent of making the canon recognize the achievement of both sexes has to put up or shut up. Either a given woman writer is good enough to replace some male writer on the prescribed reading list, or she is not. If she is not, then either she should replace him anyway in the name of telling the truth about the culture, or she should not in the unexamined name of excellence. This is the debate that will have to be engaged and that has so far been broached only in the most inclusionary of terms. Those scare quotes are in the article, but I heighten them because I'm going to proceed to argue for the most inclusionary of terms. Also, I think this is a really staggeringly bad series of arguments. Now, I understand the need for a good polemical essay now and then. And again, if you go back to 1983, I know that when Robinson sat down to write this essay, women and minorities were all but absent, even from reading lists in American literature. And this has been my shtick for about 20 years now. The canon debate about Western civilization, not only is like Jabberwocky, but no one's really suggesting, to take a famous example, that we should also assign Aristotle's sister. The real debate, the really contentious debate, has always been about American literature. And I think that's for obvious reasons, partly because the canon in American literature has never been all that settled to begin with. American literature was only taught in American universities in any regular way starting in the 20s. And only in the 50s did it admit some modern American literature. And so when canon revisers came and bursting in the 70s and 80s, they had this rhetoric, as Robinson does, of being insurgents, but in some ways they were knocking down an open door. But before 1980, the facts are really quite stunning. Of all the top 20 writers taught in American college courses, only Emily Dickinson and Ralph Ellison were not white guys. A study conducted in 1972 by the National Council of Teachers of English found that most anthologies marketing themselves as collections of American literature included no non-white writers at all. In fact, the standard anthology, The American Tradition in Literature, included its first black writer in its third edition in 1967 when it printed 2 poems by Leroy Jones, Summary Baraka, prefaced by the words, quote, Jones is easily the most interesting of the young Negro poets, but race is not often an issue in his poetry and does not restrict its appeal. That was the representation of black literature until 1979. So the explosion of the multicultural anthologies, the Heath anthology, the new Norton African American anthology, the new Norton anthology, which is now like 8 volumes. It's inclusionary. It takes up an entire shelf. It's so inclusionary. Is really quite recent. But what Robinson does here, and even though I understand the polemical purpose in 83, but what she does is to construe canon revision precisely as a zero-sum game. Either a given woman is good enough to replace some male writer on the prescribed reading list, or she is not. And if she is not, then she should replace him anyway, maybe in the name of telling the truth about the culture. I thought that was a weak argument when I first read this essay in 1986. I was writing a seminar paper on feminism and theory, and even then I asked, what if one of the truths about a culture is that for most of its history, its cultural production has been dominated by men? But that's not what bothers me now. Instead, what I really object to is the conflation of the canon with the individual syllabus. The canon and hence the syllabus based on it. A move, I think, that plays directly into the hands of the cultural right. Now, if this were just an isolated case, in which someone mistook the entire range of written literature, or even just the entire range of written literature in English, for what can be covered in a semester or two, I wouldn't call attention to it. But this has been the response of curriculum revisionists at almost every point, to defend the perfectly defensible enterprise of expanding the textual archive of our collective past in college courses. We talk about why one writer should replace another. Astonishingly, when Charles Junkerman, who was Stanford's Assistant Dean of Undergraduate Studies back in the day, when Junkerman wrote to the Wall Street Journal in early 1989 to protest that newspaper's misstatements about the Stanford curriculum, he opened by noting, this is completely okay. Your attack on the cultures, ideas, and values program is misinformed on several counts. For example, when you say that Dante's Inferno is out but I, Rigoberto Menchú, is in, you imply that there was some sort of one-for-one swap and that further Dante is not being taught in the Civ program at Stanford. You must remember that the Europe and the Americas course is a pilot for one of at least 8 tracks in the Civ program. All well and good. But then for some reason he couldn't stop himself from adding the following, and this made the rounds of the New Criterion and the usual journals. Junkerman. For example, 50 years ago, John Locke seemed indispensable in answering a question like, what is social justice? In 1989, with a more interdependent world order, a more heterogeneous domestic population, and mass media and communication systems that complicate our definitions of society and individual, it may be that someone like Frantz Fanon, a black Algerian psychoanalyst, will get us closer to the answer we need. Oh, no. Never mind the logic of the one-for-one swap. Just the name Frantz Fanon alone is enough to send any hardened right-wing culture warrior into a phantasmagoric reverie of the 60s. Oh, when they had all those problems and certain people were reading about the virtues of cleansing violence. Then to suggest that Fanon might displace John Locke, of all people. Goodness gracious, why not just go the whole distance and suggest we should teach our children we'd be better off burning the Declaration of Independence and replacing it with the wretched of the earth. Don't get me wrong. There is a very strong case to be made for the proposition that if you want to understand the history of decolonization, which is a history that involves a good deal of the people living on the planet, then you really should be acquainted with the work of Fanon. But there is no need whatsoever to present this as a swap for Locke or anyone else. On the contrary, when someone complains about Fanon's presence on a reading list, that's just the time to say, we need more courses on Fanon and his legacy, and more courses on Locke, and more courses on Aquinas, and more courses on Adam Smith. Really just up the ante. All of these guys. If you want to understand the world you live in, you need all these guys and many more. That's what we should have said on my side of the aisle. We should have taken Lillian Robinson's line in the opposite direction. We should have challenged our critics to put up or shut up. You're worried about the decline of the humanities in college courses? Shucks. So are we. That's why we propose a new 4-course introductory core program in Western and Eastern philosophy, followed by a 3-course core requirement in the history of world literature and a 3-course core requirement in world history. History, literature, philosophy, 10 courses, 30 credits for every single undergraduate who attends the University of Leftist Indoctrination. We should have argued that we need all these humanities courses. Our students need all these humanities courses because the humanities are central to public life and to the project of nurturing an informed and literate citizenry in a democracy. But we didn't. Instead, we bought into the zero-sum logic and we played parlor games with each other in which we proposed dropping one dead white guy or another. Some of us indeed went further and denounced the entire Western intellectual tradition for racism, sexism, homophobia, ageism, ableism, republicanism, bagism, and dragism. We did and do, after all, have a few people who, when they hear the phrase Western culture, reach for their guns. That's what you get for reading that Fanon. And insofar as they too pretend that the Western intellectual tradition speaks in one voice and to one purpose, they unwittingly did the work of the cultural right for it. Now, back to that Rachel Donadio essay on the legacy of Alan Bloom. It quotes, as usual, all the usual suspects, and I am pleased to say, no, actually I'm thoroughly ambivalent to say, I am now one of them. I am the fourth person quoted in the essay, and as you all know, in this genre, the fourth spot in the batting order goes to someone who says something snarky. So I'm pleased to do. This is what I said. The old guard had very little to offer in the way of serious intellectual argument against the reading and teaching of Olaudah Equiano or Juno Barnes or Zora Neale Hurston. So the canon of the past 2 or 3 centuries got itself revised in fairly short order. Only the Department of Surly Curmudgeons still disputes that we're dealing with a usefully expanded field. Okay, I hope there are some surly curmudgeons in the room, because I really, or at least people willing to role play surly curmudgeons or just nice curmudgeons, because I actually do love a serious conversation about how to handle this expanded field. I chose my 3 writers carefully. I tried to pick writers who were intellectually complex and historically important, writers that would compel my hypothetical curmudgeonly antagonists to think up some really good arguments for ignoring their work, and of course writers with weird letters in their names like Q and Z and DJ. But then watch how Donadio pivoted in the very next paragraph, deliberately constricting that usefully expanded field I spoke of until it's almost as if she's really reading from Lillian Robinson's playbook. Donadio. Reading lists, though, are a zero-sum game. Again, for every writer added, another is dropped. One can debate the changing fortunes of writers on the literary stock market, but it's clear that today the emphasis is on the recent past, at the expense, some argue, of historical perspective. As Alan Wolfe puts it, everyone's read Things Fall Apart, dash, close quote, dash, Chinua Achebe's novel about post-colonial Nigeria, dash, quote, but few people have read the Yeats poem that the title comes from. I don't usually read punctuation, but I do it here for a reason. Because this line is just wrong for so many reasons. First, we have Alan Wolfe claiming that everyone's read a novel for which the American paper of record has to supply an identifying tag. Right? Chinua Achebe's novel about post-colonial Nigeria, dash. Then there's the fact, I love this, the identifying tag is wrong. And the New York Times had to append a correction to the online version of the essay. Quote, an essay on September 16 about literature curriculums in American universities. Does anybody know the second declension? In American universities, referred incorrectly to Things Fall Apart, a 1958 novel about Nigeria by Chinua Achebe. It is set around the turn of the 20th century during the early period of British colonization, not in post-colonial times. That's 2. Then, 3, there's the fact that Wolfe's ridiculous claim is hauled out as evidence of the zero-sum game of canon revision. See, somebody killed something. This time we know Achebe killed Yeats. And by the way, if we're talking about historical perspective, going back to Yeats, that's not, as far as I'm concerned, Yeats is yesterday, all right? Yeats is last Thursday. Now, I had an email exchange with Wolfe about this. He's a very genial guy. He said, okay, you poked me in the ribs. But I enjoy reading your poking me in the ribs. So I wrote back and said, now I feel terribly curmudgeonly. That was really gracious of you. But I mean, what were you thinking? And he said, I thought I made it clear to Ms. Donadio, I was really talking about the K-12 curriculum in high school, Achebe is pretty, and I thought, okay, A, why would you say that in a story that's about the college curriculum? B, that touches on something, that's a whole, how they say, a whole nother can of worms, namely that I think a lot of American high schools have basically given up on poetry altogether. I mean, Things Fall Apart is a silly one to pick. Things Fall Apart has got to be, alongside The Wasteland, one of the most cited poems in the language. And a number of academic bloggers over the past month have had a lot of fun with this. One remembered a hypothetical National Lampoon bestseller list in which every single title was, was things like Slouching Toward Bethlehem, Didion, or The Widening Gyre. Every single title was drawn from Things Fall Apart. Likewise, I've had the same experience when I went back to the Yeats exhibit in the National Museum in Dublin last year of trying to read Byzantium afresh because I felt like Hamlet. It's so full of quotations. Okay, then back to what's wrong about this. There's the fact that in the paragraph immediately before I appear, Donadio writes the following, quote, the invasion of politics has been particularly notable in the literature curriculum. On campus today, the emphasis is very much on studying literature through the lens of identity, ethnic, gender, class. So far, so good. I think that's true. There has also been a decided shift towards works of the present and recent past. In 1965, the authors most frequently assigned in English classes were Shakespeare, Milton, Chaucer, Dryden, Pope, and T.S. Eliot, according to a survey by the National Association of Scholars, an organization committed to preserving the Western intellectual heritage. In 1998, they were Shakespeare, Chaucer, Jane Austen, Milton, Virginia Woolf, and Toni Morrison. So you got that? I wish I had the... Shakespeare, Milton, Chaucer, Dryden, Pope, and Eliot have been replaced by Shakespeare, Chaucer, Austen, Milton, Woolf, and Morrison, and we are supposed to understand the exchange of Dryden, Pope, and Eliot for Austen, Woolf, and Morrison as a notable invasion of politics. About people who would lament the recognition accorded Woolf and Austen and the demotion of Pope and Dryden, the most charitable thing I can say is de gustibus. As for Eliot and Morrison, whatever their relative merits, surely in 1965, the year of his death, Eliot would have been counted as an author of the present or recent past. However, not many people know that the cause of Eliot's death was actually Toni Morrison. But again, what I found really galling about this was the reduction of the canon to the syllabus. So I replied, as the academic blogs batted this around, this was my reply on Crooked Timber. In reality, I said, for every writer added, a writer is added to the field of literary study, perhaps to a freshman level survey, perhaps to a lower division undergraduate course, perhaps to an upper division course on a literary genre or period, perhaps to an undergraduate honor seminar, to a graduate seminar. Those are just the basic possibilities for teaching assignments. Quiet as it's kept, Morrison lied, the college literature curriculum does not consist of one course on the West's greatest hits. You can read Achebe in one course and Yeats in another. Then there are all the possibilities for research, for literary criticism, for scholarly editing. And again, one of the things that happened in canon revision is that there's been an editing boom of bringing these things back and tacking new scholarly introductions onto them and providing them with footnotes for new anthologies, for literary history. In none of these endeavors is there a zero-sum game among writers. A new book on the poetry of H.D. does not wipe out another book on the poetry of Wordsworth and Coleridge. And a new book on the long 18th century is enriched, not enfeebled, by a scholar's study of a wide range of writers and works. Yeah, that's from the blog. And then, last but not least, then there's the fact that after I blogged about the foolishness of all this, Andrew Sullivan, another very bright guy, replied on his Atlantic Monthly blog by writing, "Of course emphasis on some new writers takes up time and space from the old ones. Students have only so much time, and the bulk now have choices other than the classic canon." Sometimes I think, what is a reasonable person to do? And then I think maybe I only have two options. The first is start yelling really loudly, in the hope that that might help me make my point. I'm not going to do that. The second is to take a deep breath and explain, once again with feeling, how a usefully expanded field can really be a usefully expanded field. So, let's talk about credit hours. This is the dramatic part. No, really, credit hours. Your average university requires about 120 credit hours for a bachelor's degree, or roughly 40 classes. At Columbia, the core curriculum, one of the more rigorous in American academia, I might add, since it involved a year of philosophy, a year of literature, and a semester each of arts and music, accounted for all of 22 of those credits. That's all. It really wouldn't be very hard to administer this usefully expanded field in the humanities, the Western Canon, over 5 or 6 courses. And here, finally, we come to conservative critiques of American academia that I largely agree with. We are prevented from doing this, by and large, by the cafeteria model of higher education. Although I feel compelled to add that the elective system was not the bong-induced creation of 60s liberals, but rather the brainchild of Harvard President Charles William Eliot, who took, well, he actually was from the 60s, it was 1860s, all right. 1869, he actually took the office. He was in it for about 3 decades. I'm not suggesting we move away from the elective system entirely. I'm simply saying that the canon debates have to be seen in more realistic terms. For one thing, at most universities the size of Penn State, Illinois, 2 places I've taught, and I'm going to presume Texas, though I don't know, at least the 2 I know, general education is an unfunny joke. It is a name for a loose array of courses on a checklist of area requirements where a student picks an intro from science column A, another intro from humanities column B, and so on. The process by which this gen ed curriculum is composed is precisely that of the way laws and sausages are made. Occasionally, some reasonably savvy campus lefty will point out that the reason we don't have more core curricula in the humanities at American universities is that the engineering, information technology, and business faculty won't stand for it, neither will their students. They are primarily professional training programs, they say, and their graduates will have no use whatsoever for Homer or Hegel. And occasionally, we'll try to make a soundbite out of this by asking why the Wall Street Journal doesn't complain more loudly about the fact that business majors don't have to read any John Locke or Virgil before they graduate. But engineering and business aren't the only culprits here. I'm fond of that soundbite myself, but I actually do know better. Because I've spent my career in English departments, and I was an English major, I'm accustomed to thinking of undergraduate majors as entities that involve about 10 or 12 courses or 30 to 36 credit hours. And I think I'll just take someone at random from the audience. Maybe Amanda Marcotte, if you were an English major. How many courses does that involve? Okay, that's not too bad. Well, I see here in Texas it's 33 credits. Did I get that right? Okay. At Columbia, we required, among our 30 credits, to take 4 out of 5 courses before 1800. They were in sequence. We took them all out of sequence, too, of course. There's no way to actually start with Beowulf and make your way to Blake in any sort of order. Excuse me. And I was compelled to explain to an advisor why I was taking as many as 39. So imagine my surprise when I became the director of a humanities program in Illinois and was appointed to a task force on the arts and humanities in 1997. And I learned, we were actually trying to devise a little core curriculum across the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences and the School of Fine and Applied Arts. The principal barrier to my desire to design this curriculum was going to be called Theories and Practices of Representation, which is pretty wide. And there was some people who said, well, if you have theory in there, it'll sound too presentist. And I thought, I don't see why theories of representation lets out Plato, but okay. But that wasn't really, people quibbled about every last thing, but the real barrier was not anything ideological. It was the fact that the departments in the fine and applied arts had undergraduate majors that required 60 and 70 credit hours. So on my way down here, I thought I'd just check out some of the other majors at Penn State, because I don't do this kind of thing all the time, and there's this sort of faculty senate thing. I have no idea what some of the other majors entail. Education, 45 credits. Fitness studies, 59. Even in fitness studies, you got to take statistics. I think statistics just like worms its way into every damn discipline. Right? It's the Department of Damn Lies, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. Hotel, restaurant, and institutional management, by the way, which okay, it sounds silly, but actually Penn State has a whole hospitality thing. They run the hotel, they run a cafe, and people do have to do that. Right? I'm not going to complain about hotel and restaurant management people at universities. I am going to complain that it's 56 credits for the major. Landscape architecture, a 5-year BA, 89 credits of 146. The situation, I'm telling you, is absurd. Critics of the cafeteria system have it only half right. Yes, when it comes to the general curriculum, universities are very loosely structured, and general education consists basically of a series of compromises among faculty in physics and communication and theater and criminal justice and psychology and landscape architecture. But when it comes to the structure of majors, some departments like mine are loosely structured. I mean, we don't even know what our 30 credits are for, but we'll fight to the death to keep them, right? And some demand that students take half or more of their college courses in one department. And then when someone like me shows up and says, actually the curriculum can easily accommodate traditional and revised canons in the humanities, everyone rushes to the door and says, no room, no room. Heaven forfend, the English major require 40 or 50 credit hours of its undergraduates. God forbid our undergraduates take 5 or 6 courses in Western civilization and its discontents. And I'll tell you why we in English don't get more possessive about our majors in this way. We live in fear. We know we account for just under 4% of all BAs awarded in the United States, and we hang our heads in shame and flagellate ourselves whenever we are told that we have fallen from the glory days of 1970. We like that narrative of precipitous decline and fall in my field, partly because it allows us to believe that once we were the queen of the disciplines. In reality, I know I've used that phrase tonight, the mid to late 1960s increase in English departments was a historical anomaly, a blip in the history of the Republic, and no one, that I know, has ever accounted for it satisfactorily. We peaked in 1970 when we accounted for 7.5% of all BAs awarded in the US. I mean, those were our glory days, when the glass was only 92.5% empty. All right. Here's the big picture. In 1950, English awarded 4% of all BAs. In 1980, 3.5%. In 1993, 4.8%. Today, 3.8%. In other words, this is a pretty stable range of fluctuation over 60 years. If you know the 5%ers for the Nation of Islam, we're the 4%ers of the undergraduate curriculum. But we keep telling ourselves, and we keep being told, that we have been bleeding constantly since 1970, and we live in fear that if we bump up the major requirements, students will leave us altogether, and the dean will close our doors at last. Now,